Welcome everybody. On behalf of Catholic Mission Australia and the Australian Cardijn Institute, I'd like to welcome you all, lay people, religious, priests, bishops, and even a cardinal, and from at least 3 continents that I'm aware of so far, as well as Australia. We have participants from Asia, Singapore, from Africa, Ghana, and South Africa, and as well as, of course, from Europe, Cardinal Michael being in Rome and myself being in France. So it is quite an international event, even though it is mainly billed as an Australian event. Just to let you know, this is the second Cardijn Lecture following our successful inaugural event last year with Venezuelan theologian Raphael Luciani, an expert on synodality. And this year we're privileged to have Cardinal Michael Czerny, SJ, Prefect of the Vatican Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, as our speaker this year. I would like to say, however, there is one person who won't be joining us today, and in fact it was the first person to register for this event. A Sydney priest, Father Peter Marr, probably known to quite a number of you here. Peter sadly died of cancer just a week ago, I think on the 8th of November, if I'm not mistaken. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to remember Peter and all the various ministries he had, which I'm sure that many of you are familiar with. We'll have an obituary to him on our website very soon. So let's just remember him as we begin with a short prayer and acknowledgement of country. Sean, are you ready to lead us in prayer and acknowledgement?
Certainly. Thank you, Stefan. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean from the Australian Young Christian Workers. Before we begin, I'd like to take this time to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all meet and come from. For those joining us from Australia, we pay our respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, past, present, and especially to those who have joined us tonight. I'd like to thank you, Stefan, for organising this webinar. As a member of the YCW, I understand the importance of Cardijn methodology. And having just come back from the International Council in Peru, it is evident that it is as important today as when Cardijn first shared it with young workers. I'd like to now ask us to acknowledge the presence of the Lord before we begin our prayer. For those of us joining who are not of the Catholic or Christian faith, I'd like to invite you to use this opportunity to pause and reflect on the struggles and desires of young workers across your country and the world. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus, a worker like me, help me and my fellow workers to think like you, to work with you, to pray through you, to live in you, to give you all my strength and my time. May your kingdom come in all our factories, farms, workshops, offices, and in all our homes. Be everywhere better known, better loved, better served. Deliver us from injustice and hatred, from evil and sin. May our souls remain in your grace today, and may the soul of every worker who died on Labour's battlefield rest in peace. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Thank you very much, Sean, and welcome back from Peru. I'm sure it was a great experience, and I hope we'll have a chance maybe to give you an opportunity to share that on another occasion. Yeah. So now it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Cardinal Michael Czerny, Jesuit, who, like my late dad, was born in Czechoslovakia, but instead of coming to Australia, his parents took him to Canada, where he grew up and entered the Jesuits in 1964. And was ordained in 1973. Afterwards, he worked extensively on human rights issues, co-founding the Jesuit Centre for Social Faith and Justice in Toronto, 1979, and working in Latin America. I'm sure he'll be able to share some of those experiences with you. In 1992, based on that experience, he was called to Rome to work at the Jesuit Social Justice Secretariat, before he became assistant to his predecessor, Cardinal Peter Turkson, at the old Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. In 2019, Pope Francis appointed him as one of 2 special secretaries for the Synod on the Pan-Amazon region. And last year, he was appointed as temporary prefect for the Dicastery for promoting integral human development. And this year was made, well, not permanent prefect, but begins his 5-year term. One thing I would like to especially mention, since we're here today, remembering Cardijn, the founder of the Young Christian Workers Movement. Cardinal Michael is in fact Cardijn's successor with his Cardinal's parish of Pietralata in Rome. And I think it's really a particularly appropriate thing that we have him with us here today. So thanks very much for joining us today, Cardinal Michael, taking the time to share with us. And over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you. And since we're going to spend a little while, let me just ask if the sound is okay, and because otherwise it's very tedious. Can people hear and as well as possible? Is it okay? All right. Very good. Very good. So yes, there's so many things to talk about. I don't know if I'll be able to limit myself to the allotted time, but
He's muted himself. We can't hear. Sorry, Cardinal Michael. Somehow your sound has got turned off. Could you start again? I don't know what happened there, but somehow your sound was turned off. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make you co-host.
All right. So do you want me to start from the very beginning?
There's always something. No, yeah. Can we hear you now?
It seems.
I'm going to make you co-host so that your sound will stay on no matter what.
All right. All right. So I was.
Nothing.
Should I go ahead or?
He's a cardinal and a Jesuit.
Can we hear you now?
Yes. But there are.
We'll have to edit this out of the video. But can we hear you now, Cardinal Michael? Can you?
I think it's okay. But there's some people who have their microphones on.
Yeah. Please, everybody, turn your microphone off.
Okay, I think, all right. So we'll start again, just to say thank you for the warm welcome. And I'm very happy to present this book, which was published in Italian a year ago and is going to come out in English at the beginning of December. In English, it's called Siblings All, Sign of the Times, The Social Teaching of Pope Francis. And I recall that when I was at university, one of the most useful books that we read was called How to Read a Book, which is obviously essential when you're beginning graduate studies. And so I'll use some of the technique from How to Read a Book to present you with this book, which unfortunately you don't yet have between your hands. And so it's a kind of a remote inspiration. But what we used to do when we were learning how to read a book is we would take the title very seriously. And so let me introduce the title as itself an introduction to the whole book, because with its 12 words, it tells you not only what the book is about, but also how the book works. And what you do is you begin with the last part, because it's the least important. It's the beginning, and that is the social teaching of Pope Francis, rooted in Vatican II. That is you might say, the point of departure. And then the sign of the times is a key theme that runs through the whole book. In a sense, it's an introduction to how to read the sign of the times. and to follow through on it. And finally, it culminates in the title, Siblings All, which is the meaning and the goal of our reading. So by reading the title in reverse, we see how Pope Francis teaches us to interpret, to embrace, to interpret, and to implement the most important sign of the times. And that is the urgent vocation to behave like the siblings that we really are. And this is the key, to behave, to treat each other like the siblings that we all are. And to develop the social friendship, that's the other key word in the title of the encyclical, the social friendship necessary to care for one another and to care for our common home. And I think just if we had just the time to meditate on these 12 words, we would find already a great message and a great encouragement. So these are the Holy Father's own words as he presented the book in the preface which he wrote. He says, fraternity, which is one of the signs of the times that Vatican II brings to light, is what our world and our common home, in which we are called to live as siblings, is in such great need of. So that is his own summary of the book in its in this essence of it, which I've identified in the title. Some of us are old enough to remember when we began to hear about Sign of the Times. Others of us learned about it later. But when we first began to hear it, and maybe since, that would be something to ask the younger participants about. But when we heard about it in the late 1960s, I think that Sign of the Times was probably the most memorable expression that came to us from Vatican II. And perhaps those of you who follow the teaching of Cardijn perhaps are especially motivated to pay attention to it. But more broadly, I think that Signs of the Times was sort of grasped by people. It was often repeated, and it was also quite misunderstood. And so I'll go back to another nostalgic reference to see if we can clarify the Sign of the Times. Again, I don't know how many of us remember this firsthand and how many heard about it later, but I'm thinking of the movie The Graduate, 1967. So right at the time of the council. And there's an important bit of dialogue between Dustin Hoffman and his future father-in-law. Maybe some of you even know it. The father-in-law says, "I want you to listen." Dustin says, "I'm listening." Father-in-law, "I have one word to say to you, plastics." I wish we could have a survey to see how many people know about plastics as a sign of the times. Plastics is an unforgettable example of the sign of the times, defined in a certain way. And this is the way we sometimes slip into using it, even in the church. It's plastics. What did it mean? What did the word plastics mean in 1967? It was an emerging trend. It was a cutting edge. It was a sign of the future. It was something that was coming. It was something to invest in. It was something to trust in. It was something that was going to be important. And so based on something which is barely perceptible now, something which seems irrelevant or small or trivial, it is able to foresee what eventually is going to happen on a large scale. And looking back, we would say that that bit of dialogue was prophetic in the sense that it foretold the future to such an extent that plastics is now not only an essential part of our life, but also an essential part of our problem in living on this planet. And so to say sign of the times is to foresee what is eventually going to happen. And talking this way makes you sound avant-garde, makes you sound as if you're ahead of the curve. And so this is a social, economic, and cultural understanding of the sign of the times. And since the church is immersed in society, we can easily end up thinking of sign of the times in the same way as we think of, as Dustin Hoffman heard about plastics. Obviously, his future father-in-law wanted him to be a prosperous investor or prosperous businessman, and to choose a booming and future booming field. By contrast, the council doesn't see the sign of the times sociologically, but in relationship to our life as followers of Jesus, as the church, as the living people of God. And so a sign of the times doesn't name a trend, a promising investment, but rather it names a need, a poverty, an empty space, somewhere where Christ is absent, but wants to be and needs to be present. I think you have lived this understanding of sign of the times every time you use the word workers or young workers. Say, Christ wants to be there. What do we need to do to help him to be present? So for us, a sign of the times isn't a promise of prosperity. It is an invitation and an opportunity to help Christ become incarnate and rise again in those absences and places of need where he wants to be our incarnate Savior. And so to really respond to a sign of the times, which is the Lord wanting to be incarnate and risen, wherever in the world he is obviously absent, requires from us not some kind of a well-educated guess about what's going to happen, but rather a full engagement and involvement in the church's real mission. And with this understanding, I think the title of the book and you'd say the promise of the book begins to come to light. So with this in mind, let me quote a few words again from the foreword in which Pope Francis says why the book was written. He says, Siblings All is intended as a guide to the encyclical Fratelli Tutti. It endeavors to bring to light and make explicit the profound link between the Church's current social teaching and the teachings of the Second Vatican Council. And so I will briefly lay out and share with you the two parts of the book. But maybe I could introduce just a small biographical note saying to you that the idea of the book was born between Father Christian Baroni and myself, a young theologian from Sicily, and this fairly mature cardinal from Rome. We cooked up this idea together because we realized in our conversations that we had two different but complementary experiences of the council. I had actually lived through it. I was a teenager when the council happened, and he, who was born in the 1990, he studied it as a graduate student of theology. So we both, in a sense, know the council, and we both appreciate the council, but from two complementary backgrounds. And both of us realized that on the one hand, all the teaching, all the magisterium, indeed all the ministry of Pope Francis is so deeply rooted in the council, and we can tell on the basis of both of our experiences of the council. But we also noticed that the Holy Father doesn't speak about the council very much. In fact, he rarely mentions it. He rarely explains how his teaching is rooted in the council, and yet it is so not only might say obvious to someone who pays attention, but it's also obviously so important. And so the proposal was, let's make this rootedness, this foundation, this source in the council explicit. Let's explain how the teaching and ministry of Pope Francis is rooted in Vatican II. And we set about doing that. And when we were in the middle of it, he published Fratelli Tutti. And so we had to scrap the idea of a book that was just about Pope Francis and Vatican II. And instead, we produced a book which showed how his teaching begins in Vatican II, but culminates in Fratelli Tutti. Fratelli Tutti, we could say, is a compendium of the teaching of Pope Francis, and therefore a contemporary compendium of the teaching of Vatican II. So that's you might say, biographically, or telling you the story, how this book in two parts came to be. The first part was thought of, and we started work on it, and then without warning, he produced Fratelli Tutti, and so we had to take that on board as well. And so the book turned out, in fact, to be an introduction to the roots of Pope Francis in Vatican II and the culmination or the synthesis or the compendium of his teaching in Fratelli Tutti. So the first part of the book, 3 chapters, sets out his social teaching in relationship to Vatican II. And here I will take one feature of the council that we think the Holy Father actually manifests very dramatically, very vividly. Dei Verbum tells us that the decree of the council tells us that God has spoken to humanity with deeds and words. In the divine action, it is the events of salvation history that manifest and confirm the teaching and realities signified by the words. So revelation is not just, you might say, verbal, but it's also active, or it's gestures, it is actions. In order to understand then the magisterium, the teaching of Pope Francis, it's not enough just to refer to his speeches or to his documents, but it is also necessary to look at his actions, his gestures. And I think as soon as I mention that, you immediately begin to think of how true that is in your own experience, how much you have learned from him by watching him, and how much you have learned from him by listening to him, how the two complement each other. And this then reveals to us what we could call the performative impact of his teaching, that his teaching doesn't just go into our minds, but that it you might say, penetrates our whole being because it involves the whole self. And we could use, if we had a whole nother hour or a whole nother week, we could see how this has proven true, beginning with Evangelii Gaudium, and then even more so in Laudato Si, and now most of all in Fratelli Tutti. So in the first part of the book, we have three chapters, and the first one answers a question which you may have heard or noticed raised sometimes, probably more in a critical tone than in a friendly one, namely the continuity or with tradition or the break with tradition. So the question is, how has Pope Francis introduced something completely novel in theology? Is his magisterium in continuity or in discontinuity with the tradition that preceded him? And as you will see in the book, we see that Vatican II is at the heart of the entire teaching of Pope Francis. And so far from being in discontinuity, the pontificate, the teaching, the gestures, and the words represent a real organic development of key themes from the council and the developments after the council applied to our own time and space. And he himself, in his preface, he explains his own experience, which sort of fits in also with what I told you about Father Christian and myself having these two different experiences of the council. We have to, maybe it's worth mentioning again that Pope Francis did not attend the council. He's the first Pope who did not attend Vatican II personally. So in that sense, his experience of the council is more like mine. He wasn't there, and nor was I, but we lived it in those years of the council. He's 10 years older than I, so he lived the council in his 20s, whereas I lived it in my teens. And also the fact that I already mentioned that he rarely quotes from the council. And yet what our first chapter shows is how totally he has absorbed and assimilated the council, especially Gaudium et Spes, and how this, the great themes of the council, which I think, especially the older ones of us who were there at that time, but also the younger ones who've learned about it, the key themes, the missionary nature of the entire people of God, the effort to listen to the present in order to discern in the light of the gospel the steps to be taken, and now most recently the rediscovery of the synodal dimension of the church. These things run right through the council, and these things run right through the teaching and magisterium and ministry of Pope Francis. Pope Francis calls for a change involving the church and society as a whole, with decisions that give new direction to people's lifestyle. Here again, we have a very compact summary of the thrust of the message, a change which involves the church and society as a whole. And maybe this is new for us to understand these changes simultaneously in church and society, and that we have not only a service to offer to society, but the society can learn from how the church moves through history, how to reform itself so as to give humanity a better chance. But this means new directions to people's lifestyles. That is to say, not just changing our minds or changing how we talk, but changing how we really live. And this is where, I don't know if you say this in Australia, but in North America, we say that's where the rubber hits the road. In other words, when we talk about change in lifestyle and change in how we live our values and our commitments, that's where it really counts. The second chapter is maybe the most critical in that it reviews the teaching of the Holy Fathers from John the 23rd to Pope Francis, and does some contrasts in ways in which the council has been conveyed to us successively by the Holy Fathers. And we see a kind of sometimes selective interpretation of the council, assimilating some things and leaving other things kind of in the background. And then we come to the third chapter, which in some ways is the heart of the matter in this sense, and you soon see why. The third chapter extracts criteria for discernment, namely how to read the signs of the times. How to read the signs of the times. And maybe the fact that I told the story from the graduate shows you how important I think this is, that we, even if we think we've learned this in the past from whatever sources, maybe it really is worthwhile to review how we live out this very central part of our faith experience, our community experience, and our commitment. And so there's a lot to learn, and I think a lot to discover. The way this book works, like, brings me back to the original point, how to read a book. The way this book works is that in this third chapter, we extract criteria for discernment for reading the signs of the times from Vatican II. And so we lay out 5 criteria. But then you have the whole second section, which is about Fratelli Tutti, where you can see the signs of the times being worked out. And that is you might say, a typical way of doing it in a serious book. But then we have 2 appendices, which maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but you could practically say correspond to another great hit of the 1960s, namely My Fair Lady, where Liza Doolittle says, "Don't tell me, show me." I don't know if anybody remembers that famous line, but I think it's a very interesting one. Don't tell me, show me. And in a certain sense, the appendices take the question of signs of the times. Instead of talking about them, we try to show how they are applied. And we do this in 2 different ways. First, we try to apply them to COVID, the time of COVID. In other words, how would you perceive, interpret, integrate, and respond to the signs of the times coming out of COVID, the situation in which we actually find ourselves now? And the final appendix is a biblical meditation on the signs of the times taken from the Gospel of Matthew. And it includes one very striking passage. I don't know if everybody finds it as intriguing as I do. It's the passage where the kids are playing in the market and they complain, one group complains, we played a dirge and you didn't mourn. We played happy music and you didn't dance. I don't know if other people have their own interpretations of that enigmatic passage, but anyway, we take it on and use it as an illustration of discernment and reading the signs of the times. So in chapter 3, we identify 5 criteria which come from Vatican II, and I won't explain them, that would take far too long, but let me just read the titles. I think you'll find them interesting just as titles. Here are the 5. 1, faith that discerns lifestyles. I already prepared for that by commenting on lifestyles a moment ago. Secondly, the common good prevails over the logic of private interest. Thirdly, the realism of effective charity. Fourth, the preferential option for the poor. And 5th, the care of creation. And then, as I already hinted, the first appendix, which is called Siblings All After the Pandemic, applies the 5 criteria to our current situation with the hope of emerging from COVID-19 changed for the better. So when you actually get the book, which of course I hope you will do, you actually have a strategic choice. After reading the Holy Father's preface, which I think is indispensably the first thing you want to do, you might opt to read the appendices as a different kind of introduction to the book. In other words, if you agree with my presentation, or if you're convinced by my presentation that the signs of the times is a key to understanding the council and to applying Fratelli Tutti, you might want to use the 2 appendices as a kind of a more provocative and in some ways practical introduction to the topic, and then go back and read the more, you might say, the more classical presentation as you would expect in a serious book of theology. So if you go back, if you use them as an introduction, they'll kind of open up a perspective for you, a connection with your own experience. Or if you prefer, you read them the way they're presented as appendices, which is a way of looking back on what you have read, rounding out your comprehension and stimulating new thoughts, new ideas. And that also, of course, is, well, that's what they were originally intended as. That's why they're as appendices. And let me conclude this part now by saying in different words, what is a sign of the times? A sign of the times is a fact or an event, something that happens, something that is happening, which proves capable of changing us, permanently changing our mentality, our behavior. Yeah, so we recognize the sign of the times, not because it's so interesting or because it's so progressive or future-oriented, but because it's capable of touching us and changing us when it can inspire a shared awareness. Because the sign of the times isn't just for me, it's not like a personal prophecy, it's something that everybody is perceiving. When it can inspire a shared awareness that can modify things, can change things in a saving direction, in the direction which Christ is urging, in the direction in which Christ has lived and died, and thereby change the relations among us. Change the relations among us. And once again, siblings all, recognizing that we are siblings all and behaving like siblings all is to significantly change and improve our human relations, not just with the people closest to us, but also with people further away. So as you can tell, if you've been following closely, I finished presenting the first part of the book, and now I'm going to do a time check with our fearless leader to see how much time we have left, or would you like me to stop now and have questions right away? Because the second part is basically a presentation of the encyclical.
Well, that's a good question. Maybe a couple more minutes just to present, but it'd be good for people to have a chance to ask you a few questions before you have to leave. That would be great too. So maybe based on when you have to leave, that would be a way to discern, perhaps.
All right. Well, so how much longer would you like me to talk before we have questions? Till
another 5 minutes or so, shall we say?
Okay,
yeah.
Very good. Very good. All right. So then we've already touched on 3 chapters. The remaining 5 chapters are a careful analysis of Fratelli Tutti. And since you have the encyclical already, you don't have to wait to get the book to figure out what are the chapters, because they are there in Fratelli Tutti. Let me just briefly touch on them. So in one sense, I'm telling you about this book that I'm presenting, but in another sense, it's just the outline of the encyclical. And so let me present it to you this way, that the first chapter of the encyclical is the invitation to take a serious look at the mess we're in. Now you might easily say, well, yes, that's quite obvious, and so we start with I think according to a certain great cardinal whom we're honoring today, you start by seeing, right? You start by seeing. And maybe you've had the same experience that I have over time, which is that from time to time, one is surprised how difficult it is to see, how reluctant we are to see, how afraid we are to see, how we flee from seeing. In other words, the sort of positivist bias that we have is, well, facts are facts and it's there in front of everybody's nose and there's nothing more to be said about it. That's just not true. We spend an enormous amount of energy fleeing from reality. We spend a lot of energy protecting ourselves from reality. And the more privileged we are, the more protected we are. And we spend a lot of time disguising reality, because if we were to actually deal with reality, we would begin to capture the signs of the times, and we will begin to have to change our lifestyle and our response. So while it might seem a bit pedantic to spend a whole chapter on seeing the reality in which we exist. Our feeling in writing the book and in other ways of knowing this encyclical and also previous ones like Laudato Si is to pay attention to how hard it is to come to grips with reality, to try to even open oneself up to perceiving it. So that's basically the gist of chapter number 1. Chapter number 2 is very interesting. It is the representation by the Holy Father of the encyclical, of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And here I think we have an important contribution to make, because I think our normal or our typical way of responding to the encyclical, I keep calling the parable of the Good Samaritan, is, as Jesus himself tells the fellow at the end of the parable, go and do likewise. So we do a kind of a moral reading of the encyclical, with a result in a reform in our way of behaving. And of course, that is absolutely true, and that is exactly what the parable does. But maybe we take it to a different viewpoint if we say that it is also, or maybe first of all, a parable of perception. It's a parable which connects back with the previous chapter. In other words, it's a parable about seeing. That the other two characters in the parable who passed by on the other side, that prior to, or maybe instead of, a moral choice, which we consider to be immoral, namely to have passed by on the other side, that they actually were victims of blindness. They didn't they didn't see the in quotes, they didn't see the beaten up man. And this connects with our something that Pope Francis has taught us a great deal, which is that people are in the peripheries. They're peripheral, they are invisible, they are not, they are, you might say, banned from being part of our world. And so in order to have the, you might say, the transforming effect of an encounter with the poor, we first need help to see them. And even those of us who, like many of us, are listening to this or participating in this program, are engaged with people who are in real need, well, we see those, but each of us probably has other people whom we don't see, whom we don't want to see, whom we prefer not to see. And so even before making what could be called a moral choice, just at the level of perception, we walk by the other side. And so this called for conversion of our perception is already a very important step in moving towards our towards the rest of the encyclical, which is to then come to grips with this world in which we live. So in chapter 5, we've let the word of God enlighten us so that we can perceive our reality in a way that allows us to respond, invites us, stimulates us, encourages us, orients us to respond. And then the chapter 6, which corresponds to the 3rd and 4th chapters of Fratelli Tutti, are applying what we have already learned about signs of the times, discerning and judging in this world so as to come to our well, what you call act. In other words, to pass from the seeing through the judging now to the acting. So that's chapters 3 and 4 of Fratelli Tutti. And then we have 3 chapters which we sum up as building a better and more open world. And here, what I personally find very interesting is the very fact that there are three quite different chapters about three different aspects of our world. And while I don't think the Holy Father ever says it in so many words, I think the point is that if we aren't really trying to behave like siblings and we are trying to grow in this fraternal way of relating to one another, that it doesn't matter really, you might say, which issue you consider, which issue you're engaged in. It's not as if we all have to do everything. In fact, even the mystical body of Christ tells us that each of us has a different, have different roles, different contributions to make. But we work together confident that our work will be complementary, that we will help one another and that our contributions will combine to provide the graces and the blessings which the Lord wants to give to his people. So those are the three chapters, and I think they're all very interesting. And I think, personally, I think that the chapter on politics is maybe the most demanding, maybe because many of us live in these what are now so-called democracies, because democracy is in trouble. So maybe that's an interesting call to those of us who are in democracies to see whether we're really contributing to better politics or whether politics is becoming only a part of the problem. And then the eighth and final chapter of the book, which is also the eighth and final chapter of Fratelli Tutti, is in some ways the most creative or the most unusual or the most unexpected, because here the Holy Father addresses himself to all the religions. And while speaking to all the religions as such is not new, it is new that he speaks to all the religions, including our own, you might say, in the same way. In other words, our faith, our church, the Catholic Church, is there among the religions. It's not, you might say, outside the group, sending them a message or asking them a question, but it's addressed to us as a religion among the religions. And this, I think, is a very profound invitation in terms of our ecumenism, our interreligious dialogue, but also in how we understand our mission or vocation in the world. And this brings us back again then to the very title of the encyclical, or the title of our book, namely that the vocation, the calling of all the religions, is to contribute to our recognizing that we are all siblings, to taking on board the responsibility of being siblings, and learning how to act as siblings and treat each other as siblings. And so let me read the last few words of our conclusion. That helps maybe to bring this presentation to a close, and maybe you'll recognize that it sums up what I've been trying to say for the last while. The last sentence says, "The invitation to comprehend the urgency of being siblings all and its concrete implications for building a better world is then a call for each one of us to rediscover courage and zeal, calling back to mind and heart the words and promises of Jesus Christ. I no longer call you servants, but friends." And so, friends, thank you very much, and I look forward to our dialogue.
Thank you very much, Cardinal Michael. What a great introduction, not only to your book, but to the thought of Pope Francis, and also with some reflections on Cardijn's influence on, let's say, Pope Francis and the Second Vatican Council. And so I think there's a lot of thought material there for us to take away when we actually read the book. I put in the chat how you can actually purchase the book, so I hope some of you will be able to do that. We've invited Susan Pascoe, whom also many of you may know, to just give a short response to Cardinal Michael's presentation. Susan's probably best known outside of Victoria as the former Commissioner for the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, and more recently in the Church as a member or consultant on the Synod for Synodality. So, Susan, I would like to just offer you the chance to say a few words.
Thank you, Stefan. And I wonder if I could share screen just briefly.
You should be able to, yes, just go. Oh, I think I have to make.
Don't worry, it's not possible. No, that's okay.
Yeah.
In fact, no, it was an irresistible urge to build on something that Cardinal Czerny had said in his noting the performative aspect of Pope Francis's teaching and style, because for me, the unveiling of the statue of the migrants in St. Peter's Square on World Migrant and Refugee Day in 2019 was an essay, but the words didn't need to be said. The statue was unveiled and we understood its import. So I thought that was a very important point that Cardinal Czerny made, and I perhaps want to focus in on the somewhat narrowly, I suppose, but Francis as a communicator, because it strikes me that we could see this latest publication done with a foreword from the Holy Father, but as a logical sequel to Let Us Dream, which takes a distillation of the teachings of Francis and communicates them in ways that are accessible to a broad audience. And I thought I might just quote briefly from that, because part of, I think, what is the genius of the communication of Pope Francis is his constant invitation to all of the people of God, moving beyond the hierarchy to all of us. So he says in that publication, we need a movement of people who know we need each other, siblings all, who have a sense of responsibility to others and to the world. We need to proclaim that being kind, having faith, and working for the common good are great life goals that need courage and vigour, while glib superficiality and the mockery of ethics have done us no good. And there's much in that that's strongly evocative of what Cardinal Czerny has just been describing in this new book. I want to as well, on this theme of effective communication, which in effect becomes teaching, also note that for those of us who were still deeply wounded by the scars of sexual abuse, and it had a particular impact here in Australia, the letter to the people of God, published on the internet in August 2018, was another moment when Pope Francis invited, and again to quote, every one of the baptized should feel involved in the ecclesial and social change that we so greatly need. This change calls for a personal and communal conversion that makes us see things as the Lord does, and so on. So, invitation. And the invitation doesn't stop there. In many ways, you could see one of the elements of discernment that Cardinal Czerny has pointed out, which is the invitation to the Synod on Synodality. At the launch in October last year, Pope Francis used the phrase, baptism is your identity card. You don't need any other authorization than that. You are invited. We want you to contribute. And as we've seen from the global discernment that was completed in August this year, a massive outpouring from around the world. It actually tapped into a deep yearning that regular Catholics have to communicate And of course, that would be another whole presentation. So I won't dwell on that too much. I want to wind up by speaking of the deep spiritual discernment that we have here in our great southern land, that is given voice by Australia's Indigenous people. In 2017, following a couple of centuries of dispossession, the Indigenous people of Australia gathered together in the heart of Australia at the very symbolic area of Uluru and created the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I just again want to read from that because, very briefly, in 1967 we were counted. That refers to the referendum when they were regarded as citizens. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. So although this is a moment beyond the teaching of Pope Francis, it's deeply spiritual. And for me, as a Catholic in Australia, it calls to me in a particular way. And it was very pleasing to see that this was one area of Australia's Plenary Council where there was unanimity of view. So look, I want to just to draw those few comments together to thank Cardinal Czerny for a scholarly roadmap through this publication, which I'm sure we're all going to be really quite excited to read now. It takes us forward another step in our understanding both of the teaching of Pope Francis, but also back to Vatican II, and it reanimates for us a church in which all of the people of God have an active membership. So thank you very much, Cardinal Czerny, on behalf of the many people listening here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. That's great. Now, look, I'm not sure how much time Cardinal Michael has before he needs to leave for his other meeting. But there is one question. There's already a few questions in the chat, but I'll just ask one question, which I think may be particularly relevant, if you're able to take it, Cardinal Michael. I think it was Martin was particularly struck by what you said about how we flee from reality. Do you have any general guide to the kind of experience we ought to seek out if we have this freedom to improve our seeing?
Well, my feeling is that it's the key is to notice the fleeing first. In other words, I don't know that we can just sort of unilaterally improve our appreciation or our grasp of reality just by saying we want to do it. I think first you need to discover your escape tactics. How do you get away from reality? And I would underline that by saying that I think that for Pope Francis, the opposite of faith is not doubt. In fact, I think he would robustly defend the idea that we have doubts and we should entertain them so that we can deal with them, but that the real opposite of faith is abstraction. And I ask myself, when we use the word abstraction, whether we shouldn't notice that it can be it's originally, it seems to be an intellectual word. It's to be abstract or to abstract some element from a larger thing. But it's also like a word of distancing. Abstract, I abstract myself from, I back away from. And that's more physical and maybe connects more with the feeling of avoidance, the feeling of, and more deeply the feelings of fear, which we allow to run our lives. The problem is not having the fears, the problem is letting them run our lives. And I'm afraid that we are massively stimulated by irresponsible forces to live out of our fears, because that probably makes us better consumers and more docile citizens. So here we're really I think we're coming to grips with the fundamental question, which is that Jesus was incarnate in this reality. He wasn't incarnate in some kind of flight. He was incarnate in the here and now. And to be his follower is, I think, to follow him into the here and now, and lay aside all ifs, ands, and buts. This I think is spiritually the translation that this conversion of perception requires, that is illustrated in the parable of the Good Samaritan, and that our treatment of it, other Christians and my treatment of it, underlines this importance. It's trying to get to a deeper reality whereby we don't just, when we hear the call to conversion, I think the temptation or the tendency, the instinct is to understand it morally. Say, well, I've got to be better. Most of us can probably add up all the years we've spent trying to be better, and we're making a little progress. We're probably making some setbacks as well. But I ask myself whether to pay attention to our perceptions, in other words, what we allow ourselves to see or not see, what we allow ourselves to take on board, or what we consider to be outside of our realm of interest. And to put it even more bluntly, who is in for me and who is out? Who is in fact a sibling and who is not? That's where the conversion is needed, and I think that's where that's what the question points to. I don't know if I succeeded in answering. It was a very good question, but that's what I've been able to think of quickly.
Great, thanks very much for that. Actually, there's another question, which is a very Cardijn question from Dennis, who notes that also what you've said about the way that all baptized share true equality, but also Lumen Gentium speaks of what specifically characterizes the laity is their secular nature. Would you have any comment on that? Lumen Gentium number 31.
Well, that's right. I mean, what I would say is, what I would put the word incarnation there and say I mean, we need to appreciate the secular nature of the incarnation. Yeah, Jesus didn't come to be incarnate in the church. He came to be incarnate in the world. And he came to be incarnate in the world because it's the world that needs to be saved. God, we hope that the church is cooperating with salvation history, but it's the world that we're called to help save, not ourselves or the church. So that's how I would read that that concern. That now there's a whole different paragraph about the question, which could be you might say the fallout of the fact that the church was identified with Christendom, D-O-M, Christendom. So dom is the Latin root for an empire or a realm. So then we had the distinction between Christendom and secularity, and that's how much of the previous discussion went over the past century, since the last 400 or 500 years, is this terrible struggle with how to relate what seemed to be a self-enclosed Christian realm with the with whatever was outside. But I think that Vatican II I mean, it doesn't engage in that. It bypasses that, goes much further into what the question quoted, the secular vocation. Yeah, we are called to save, to help save ourselves, our brothers and sisters in this real world. So we're back again to the question of reality and whether we're afraid of it or running away from it, or whether the quotation suggests that the vocation of the Christian by baptism is to be fully engaged in the world because the world has need of the Christian.
Now, again, I know I better give you the opportunity if you do need to leave, because I know you've got another meeting coming up soon.
So
But if you do have time for one, do you have time for one or two more questions?
Let's say one more question.
One more question. Okay. Well, I will ask you this one on the list I've got, growing list, is what's your sense about how Pope Francis's themes will continue after his pontificate? Do you have a sense that his vision will continue after his pontificate, and how will that legacy live on?
Yes, well, I really won't answer the question. I will simply say that the question really is about Vatican II. And so just re-ask the question with the word Vatican II in it, and then the answer is, well, it's up to us. And I'm not being flip about it. I really think that's true. So reread the question with Vatican II in it.
So basically, if I understand your answer, it's Vatican II has to live on, not just Pope Francis. Would that be a reasonable summary?
That's what he would say if you asked him.
Yeah, well, I guess that's a good answer. And I think that's probably what Cardijn would say also. So look, we're all here, and I know there's a few other people who'd like to ask questions and intervene, but I know if you do have to go, I just like to kind of give you the freedom because if you've got another appointment, that will need to be addressed. So right now, I'd just like to thank you very much for this wonderful time that you've spent with us and sharing and introduction to Fratelli Tutti. What did I say? Fratelli Tutti. Yeah, not the other thing. And really, well, I'm sure that we'll be continuing this among ourselves in either this group or other groups. And I'm sure that your book will make a great impact, not just here in Australia, but around the world. So thank you very much for being with us. And I really just think it's totally in the line of what Cardijn would have hoped would come out of Vatican II. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let me conclude with a little quote which answers the question that I expected, but which didn't come. That is, what was it like to write a book together? And so let me say that when two writers author a work together, like siblings taking on a task, they must sort out how they will proceed. In his foreword, Pope Francis describes our working together, Father Christian Barones and I, describes our working together as, quote, a new method, an official voice, and a young voice together. That is how we should always journey. Close quote, and thank you very much, and God bless you, and I will remember you all in the Cardinal Cardijn's parish when I have a chance to visit the next time.
Thank you very much. We hope to meet you in his parish one day. Have mass with you, maybe. Yeah, that would be great.
That would be lovely. Thank you. Bye-bye. God bless everyone.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Well, that's not to say that we're going to finish now. Unfortunately, Cardinal Czerny does have to got another meeting just in a few minutes, but there's still many of us here. I know we have Bishop Vincent with us from the Bishops' Committee for Social Justice. Would you like to say a few words, Bishop Vincent?
Thank you, Stefan. Good evening, everybody. I was a bit of a John Lee come lately to this event. My flight was late in arriving back to Sydney, so I only caught the tail end of the first part of the Cardinal's presentation. But yeah, I just wanted to say that it was a very interesting way of situating the encyclical into the larger corpus of Pope Francis's social teaching, but also the continuity with the Second Vatican Council. I think that's the key hermeneutic for me, and Susan linked some of those themes in the book co-authored by Cardinal Czerny and Christian Barone, and how Second Vatican Council's ecclesiology kind of underlines all these themes. I was intrigued by the question that one of the participants raised in relation to the concept of the laity and secularity within the document Lumen Gentium. Now, for me, Lumen Gentium proposes a new metaphor, a new ecclesiology, and that new metaphor is the pilgrim people of God. So you've got that sense of engagement with the world, that sense of being in pilgrimage with humanity, as opposed to that old metaphor, the perfect society, which tends to close in on itself and regards the world as a hostile kind of environment. And so you have that concept of fuga mundi, you know, the flight from the world. So Lumen Gentium, while affirming some of the teachings or the themes in that whole ecclesiology of the two-state vision, you know, the laity, one state, and the people with sacra potestas, you know, the ordained in another state, and so the laity is supposed not to be involved in any shape or form in the sacra potestas, you know, that world is occupied or populated by the ordained only. So you've got that bit of element, but then the new vision emerges from Lumen Gentium. That is what Susan was alluding to, and that's the whole concept of the dignity and the primacy of the baptized, and so Pope Francis today, in a way, kind of makes it inadequate to talk about a two-state ecclesiology. You know, in fact, with that new motu proprio concerning the reform of the Roman Curia, the Pope gave permission to lay people to be involved in the governance of the church, and in fact, there are now lay people in different dicasteries of the church. And so you have that sort of evolving development of, or rather the application of that new ecclesiology centered on the dignity and the primacy of baptism, which I think is something that is central to the magisterium of Pope Francis.
Thank you very much, Bishop Vincent. Well, there are still a few more questions out there. One of them that's probably quite relevant is from Frank Brennan about Pope Francis's comments on the need for the world to make progress on the role of women. And what about the church? I don't know, perhaps Susan's, what have you got any comments about that?
Well, I won't dare to speak for Pope Francis, Stefan and Frank, but I can make some comment on what emerged through the global consultation. Because if you look at that, the issue of women, and for those of you who've read the the very, I like to say it's short, it's actually 25 A4 pages, 50 A5. But there's a full section on women, and it notes that the issue of effectively the underrepresentation of women was raised in virtually every submission. It's a universal issue, and that there wasn't a single identified pathway forward. So for some countries, ordination to the diaconate or to priesthood was seen as the pathway to be explored. For others, it was much more, in fact, really for the majority, I'd say it was much more about recognising and affirming the gifts and the contribution of women and making greater efforts to have them involved in decision-making and in leadership. So definitely it's there. And as people are aware, the next stage, which we're just beginning, the continental stage, is where that summary document goes back to the 7 regions. One of the regions is the Eastern churches, and they're asked to discern more deeply just on that document, not on any broad range of issues. And the document, I mean, I could talk at length on the process of the distillation of all of the matters that were raised. For me, it was a process of extraordinary integrity and robustness. And I'm happy to speak about it, but that's the next stage. And by the end of March, there are to be submissions that go back then to the Vatican that are 20 pages in length and are a further distillation of what's come from each of the regions who've looked at the issues and really asked the question, does this reflect our lived reality? So in the context of that, I think there's no doubt that the issue of women will be raised, and now that it's been raised in a significant way, perhaps raised in a more focused way, because one of the 3 questions that are asked in the document is, the first is, can you talk about any intuitions it raises for you? The second is, are there any questions or issues that you don't find resolved? And the third is to identify priorities, recurring themes, or calls to action. And that's then to go to be further summarised and then become the instrumentum laboris for the assembly, which is to occur the first of the 2 assemblies, because Pope Francis has now called for 2, in October 23 and October 24. So I think there's little doubt that women will be significant there. And just as a final statement, when you look at what came from 112 countries, of the 114 countries that have the Catholic Church in them, what was universal was people want a more welcoming, participative, and inclusive church. Now, there are 1,000 issues underneath that, but that was really significant. And of course, the role of women, of youth, and of LGBTQ stood out as the groups that are not fully recognised, whose gifts and talents are pushed to the margins in the church today. Bit longer than I expected to say, Stefan, but there we are. Thank you.
Oh, no, that was great. Thank you very much, Susan. Look, we've only got a few minutes left, and I do see if there's many other things I could ask people to speak about, but I see Tony, can't see what your surname is, Tony with an I, speaking about gender-based violence. Would you like to speak about that issue, Tony? Possibly, I don't know if we'd see that as a sign of the times, but if you'd like to make a comment about that, that'd be great. I'm not sure if Tony's still with us. Are you still with us, Tony? Anyway, maybe it's an issue we can take up in the future because, yeah, it's an issue of affecting a lot of people in these times. All right, well, we are nearly at the hour. So unfortunately, Chiara Porro, our ambassador to the Holy See, was going to say a few final words, but she's also had to leave for another meeting. That's what it's like to work in these important positions. So is there anybody else like just freely just to pipe up and share a thought or two? Let's make it open.
Stefan,
open up,
yeah.
open. Go on.
Stefan, can I give a plug to, I popped the website on for our Australian project on Signs of Our Times, which is a collaboration between the Office for Ecology, Justice and Peace and the Catholic Justice and Peace Commission in Brisbane. And that's a site that we invite people to engage and share their encounters and experience following up our understanding of signs of the times, and very much picking up the invitation from the Cardinal and on the reality of life. So I invite people to come and look at that site and hopefully engage with us.
Yeah, that's a very practical thing, because we're only just opening up the discussion this morning, aren't we, or this evening? So there's a lot of things to do. I think I've put in the chat for everybody the link to the purchase of the book, and if you registered for the site, I've also sent it to you by email, so that opportunity is there. Any other final comments? Anybody like to be the last person before we close?
Stefan, we did get a question about the recording. How will people be able to access the recording?
Yes, we are recording this, and we will clean up some of the little glitches there and have it available on YouTube as soon as my 13-year-old son can get it done, or possibly, I'm not sure actually. Well, we might have somebody else to help us with that as well. But yeah, we are going to produce this. I hope that's okay with everybody who's spoken in public. Let us know if it's not, and that's where we are. So I think, yeah, we're reaching the end of our time. So I just really would like again to thank Cardinal Michael for sharing. It's a really important day for us who are kind of disciples or apostles in the line of Joseph Cardijn. So he's really given us some new insight into how to take that further, and connected it to both Pope Francis's teaching and to Vatican II. And I think there's a lot of challenges for us in what Bishop Vincent has said, and also what Susan has said with the next 2 years of the Synod coming up. And hopefully maybe we can follow up on some of these issues in further seminars and webinars. And we look forward to working with you all in the future. And meanwhile, I'd like to thank Catholic Mission and their technical people, Marcelo and Maria, I think, and Tony also for helping us with the technical things. And I'd like to also finally remember our friend Peter Ma. I think he'll be buried in a couple of days' time. Thank you all for joining us, and see you soon.
Thank you, Stefan.
Thanks, Stefan. Thanks, everyone.
Well done. Thank you.
Bye.